The battlefield smelled like burning metal and blood that wasn't quite the right color. Sergeant Marcus Reed crouched behind a collapsed defensive wall, catching his breath after 6 straight hours of combat that had turned Crava's Ridge from strategic mining colony into smoking hellscape. They'd won. Barely. The Dominion forces had retreated after the Concordance reinforcements finally arrived, leaving behind a landscape that looked like it had been processed through industrial machinery designed specifically to break things. Marcus's squad was intact, everyone accounted for, various degrees of injured but alive. Around him, soldiers from a dozen different species conducted battlefield triage, pulling wounded to safety, marking bodies for recovery, establishing perimeter security. That's when he heard the Cathari soldiers arguing. Not loudly. Cathari didn't do anything loudly. They were a people of controlled intensity, their emotions expressed through subtle shifts in posture and the colors pulsing through the bone-white markings that traced elaborate patterns across their skin. But Marcus had spent 6 months working alongside Cathari units, long enough to recognize when their careful composure was masking deep distress. He moved closer, navigating around debris, and saw the problem. Commander Zira Velstrom lay collapsed against a shattered wall section, her armor cracked along the chest plate where a Dominion plasma bolt had struck her. Even from 15 meters away, Marcus could see she was in bad shape, breathing labored, her usually pristine white markings now pulsing with erratic colors that suggested pain and trauma. 5 Cathari soldiers stood nearby, clearly her unit, their posture screaming conflict between wanting to help and being paralyzed by something invisible but absolute. Marcus's translator caught fragments of their conversation. Can't touch her without permission. She's commanding officer, the taboo, if she dies because we hesitate. Sergeant Torven, the Cathari squad leader Marcus had worked with most frequently, stood slightly apart from the group, his markings pulsing with colors that suggested profound internal conflict. Marcus approached him. What's happening? Why aren't they helping her? Torven turned, and his expression carried weight Marcus couldn't fully read. You don't understand our ways. Commander Velstrom is Cathari nobility, decorated warrior, superior officer. Touching her without explicit permission is grave insult. Being seen as weak enough to require aid is profound shame. She's wounded. She needs medical attention. Yes, Torven's markings pulsed frustrated crimson, but she hasn't asked for help, and to offer without her asking would dishonor her. Our culture. Your culture is going to let her die while you all stand there watching. Marcus heard his voice rise and forced it back down. There has to be protocol for this. Emergency medical exceptions. There is, but it requires the superior officer to formally request assistance. She hasn't. Torven looked at Commander Velstrom and his expression was agonized. And she won't. She's too proud. She'd rather die than show that kind of weakness. Marcus stared at the scene. A decorated commander bleeding out while her own troops stood immobilized by cultural programming that made helping her impossible without her permission, and her too proud to give that permission even as she deteriorated. That's insane, he said. That's Cathari. Torven's tone carried resignation mixed with something that might have been shame. Our strength is our pride. Our survival has always depended on appearing invulnerable. To show weakness is to invite attack, to lose standing, to betray everything our culture values. Even when it kills you. Especially then, better to die strong than live weak. Marcus looked at Commander Velstrom again. From this distance, he could see her trying to push herself upright and failing, her arms trembling with effort. She was conscious, aware of her situation, probably furious at her own body's betrayal, and she was dying. Not immediately. Cathari were tough, their biology adapted to high-gravity worlds with dangerous fauna, but her injuries needed treatment soon or they'd become fatal. Every rational part of Marcus's training said to respect the local culture, to follow established protocols, to let the Cathari handle this their way. Every human part of him said this was wrong and someone needed to fix it. He stopped, reconsidering. What happens if someone who isn't Cathari helps her, someone not bound by your cultural rules? Torven's markings flashed bright gold surprise. You're considering, he stopped. Marcus, no. You'll dishonor her worse than we would. At least if her own soldiers break taboo, it can be framed as emergency loyalty. But if an alien, a human, treats her as helpless, she won't have to worry about honor if she's dead. She would disagree strongly. Marcus looked at Torven, at the other Cathari soldiers frozen by cultural programming, at Commander Velstrom trying desperately to maintain composure while her body gave out. He made a decision that was going to get him in serious trouble. Then she can yell at me about it after she's not bleeding internally. Torven's markings pulsed through several colors rapidly. Alarm, disbelief, something that might have been relief. Marcus, if you do this. I know, diplomatic incident, cultural insult, probably court-martial. Marcus was already moving toward the commander, pulling his medical kit. Add it to my file. He crossed the 15 meters quickly, ignoring the startled reactions from Cathari soldiers, who finally noticed the human approaching their fallen commander. Commander Velstrom's eyes tracked him as he knelt beside her, assessing her injuries with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic. Cracked armor, plasma burns, probably internal bleeding from the impact. She needed proper medical attention within the next 30 minutes or her prognosis got significantly worse. Sergeant Reed. Her voice was strained but steady. You will step back, that's an order. Respectfully, Commander, I'm going to ignore that order. Marcus pulled out his portable medical scanner. You need immediate treatment. I forbid. She stopped breathing hard. You don't understand what you're doing. The dishonor. I understand you're wounded and need help. That's enough understanding for me. The scanner confirmed his visual assessment. Internal hemorrhaging, 3 fractured ribs, second-degree plasma burns. Bad but treatable if they got her to medical quickly. Commander Velstrom's markings blazed with colors Marcus didn't recognize, probably rage mixed with humiliation. If you touch me without permission, you violate sacred tradition. You dishonor me before my troops. You can explain all the ways I'm terrible after you're not dying. Marcus slid one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and carefully lifted her. She was heavier than he expected. Cathari bone density was significantly higher than human, but Marcus had spent years training to carry wounded comrades under combat conditions. He adjusted his grip, finding balance, and stood. Commander Velstrom went rigid in his arms, her entire body locked with shock. Around them, the Cathari soldiers made sounds Marcus's translator rendered as profound dismay. Put me down. Her voice shook with suppressed rage. Immediately, that's a direct order. Medical station is 300 meters that way. Marcus started walking, his muscles already protesting the weight. We can argue about protocol when you're stable. You don't, she stopped, pain cutting through her words. This is unforgivable. Probably, but you'll be alive to not forgive me, which seems like a net positive. He navigated around debris, moving as quickly as he could without jostling her too much. Behind them, he heard Cathari soldiers beginning to follow, their voices carrying shock and confusion. Commander Velstrom tried once more, her voice weaker now. You'll be punished for this, severely. Yeah, I figured. Marcus adjusted his grip as he stepped over a collapsed beam. Worth it, though. Why? The question came out genuinely confused, as if she couldn't comprehend someone risking punishment to help her. Because you needed help and I could provide it. Marcus was breathing harder now. 300 meters while carrying someone who weighed considerably more than you did was no joke. That's reason enough. Her markings pulsed through colors he couldn't interpret, and she fell silent except for labored breathing. Smoke still drifted across the battlefield, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of a structural collapse. He kept moving, focusing on the path ahead, trying not to think about how many cultural rules he was violating or what the consequences would be. just focused on reaching the medical station before the decorated Kithari commander in his arms stopped breathing entirely. 200 meters left. Marcus's arms were burning, his back screaming protest at the sustained weight. Commander Velstrom had stopped arguing, which worried him more than her earlier anger. She was conscious but deteriorating, her breathing increasingly shallow. They emerged from the worst of the smoke and debris into a clearer area where other wounded were being triaged. A human medic named Patterson spotted them and came running, portable scanner already active. Commander Velstrom, plasma strike to the chest, internal, Marcus started. I can see what she needs, Patterson interrupted, his scanner beeping frantically as it processed Kithari biology crossed with combat trauma. Shit. Internal hemorrhaging, fractured ribs, plasma burns. We need to get her to surgery now. This way, another voice called, a Tolian nurse whose 4 arms were already prepping equipment. Trauma Bay 2 is clear. Marcus followed, his muscles threatening mutiny with every step. Around him, other medical personnel moved with practiced efficiency, clearing paths, preparing equipment, calling for surgical teams. The Kithari soldiers who'd been following stopped at the medical station's perimeter, watching with expressions Marcus couldn't fully read. Some looked outraged, others looked confused. A few younger warriors seemed thoughtful, as if witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions. Trauma Bay 2 was a controlled chaos of alien medical technology and harried staff. The surgical team, mixed species, all professionals who'd seen too many battlefields, moved with choreographed precision. Careful transfer on my count, the lead surgeon said, positioning the surgical gurney beside Marcus. 1, 2, 3. They lifted Commander Velstrom from his arms to the gurney, with movements designed to minimize additional trauma. Marcus stepped back, his arms shaking now that they were free of weight, and nearly fell as his exhausted legs decided they were done supporting him. Patterson caught his elbow. You okay? Fine, just carried someone 50 pounds heavier than me across a battlefield. Marcus's lungs were burning, his heart rate still elevated. How is she? Surgery now, or she doesn't make it. Patterson was already moving toward the surgical prep area. You did good getting her here, Reed. Another 10 minutes and we'd be having a different conversation. The surgical team wheeled Commander Velstrom toward the operating theater. As they moved past Marcus, her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. He looked down to find her silver eyes fixed on him, her expression complex, pain, confusion, something that might have been gratitude mixed with profound shame. You shouldn't have, she said, her voice barely audible over the medical equipment. Yeah, well, I'm human. We're bad at letting people die because of rules. Her markings pulsed colors he didn't understand before the surgical team moved her away. Through the sterile field into the theater where they'd try to repair what the Dominion plasma bolt had damaged. Marcus stood in the trauma bay, suddenly aware that he was covered in blood. Hers. His own from various minor injuries he'd ignored during combat, probably others, from the general chaos of battlefield triage. Patterson returned with a scanner. Your turn, sit. I'm fine. You just carried a Kithari commander 300 meters. You're definitely not fine. Sit down before you fall down. Marcus sat, letting Patterson run scans and apply field dressings to injuries he'd barely registered during the adrenaline of combat and rescue. Bruised ribs, strained muscles, plasma burns on his left arm that would need proper treatment later. You're aware you just caused a significant diplomatic incident, Patterson said conversationally while bandaging Marcus's arm. So I've been told, repeatedly. Kithari cultural taboos about physical contact are serious. Touching a superior officer without permission is less serious than letting her die while everyone stands around worried about etiquette. Marcus heard the edge in his voice and tried to moderate it. Sorry, long day. Patterson finished the bandaging and stepped back. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Culture is important, but survival seems more important. though I suspect the brass won't see it that way. Marcus looked through the trauma bay's windows toward where Kithari soldiers were still gathered, their postures suggesting intense discussion. Torvin stood slightly apart from the group, his markings visible even at this distance, pulsing with colors that suggested deep conflict. "How long until we know if she'll make it?" Marcus asked. "Surgery for injuries like hers. 2, maybe 3 hours. She's Kithari, though tough as hell. If anyone can pull through, it's her." Patterson collected his equipment. "You should clean up, get some rest. Something tells me tomorrow's going to be complicated." "Yeah," Marcus stood, his body protesting every movement. "Thanks, Doc." "Thank you, Sergeant. What you did took courage. Stupid, culturally insensitive courage, but courage nonetheless." Marcus made his way through the medical station toward the decontamination area, passing soldiers from a dozen species. Some nodded acknowledgement. Others stared with expressions ranging from approval to confusion to what might have been condemnation. Word was spreading fast. A human marine had carried Commander Velstrom, decorated Kithari warrior, superior officer, member of ancient military lineage, against her explicit orders, violating fundamental cultural taboos. Reactions would vary by species, by personal philosophy, by how much someone valued cultural tradition versus immediate pragmatism. Marcus suspected he was about to find out exactly where Concordance Command fell on that spectrum. He decontaminated, changed into clean fatigues, and was heading toward his quarters when Torvin intercepted him in the corridor. "Sergeant Reed." Marcus stopped. "Sergeant Torvin, how's your unit?" "Intact, thanks to reinforcements arriving when they did." Torvin's markings pulsed through several colors before settling on uncertain blue. "And thanks to you preventing additional casualties from standing protocol." "I didn't prevent anything. Just did what seemed necessary." "You violated sacred Kithari tradition. You touched Commander Velstrom without permission, ignored her direct orders, treated her as helpless before her own troops." Torvin's voice carried weight Marcus couldn't fully interpret. "By strict cultural law, what you did is unforgivable." Marcus met his eyes steadily. "Am I supposed to apologize?" "No." Torvin's markings shifted to colors that might have been respect mixed with sadness. "I'm supposed to tell you that there will be consequences. Formal inquiry, probably. My people will demand accountability for the insult to their commander and their culture." "I understand." "Do you?" Torvin stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Because what you don't understand is that you've forced Kithari Command to confront something we've been avoiding for generations. What happens when our traditions directly conflict with survival needs? What happens when cultural pride becomes literally fatal?" He paused, his markings cycling through complex patterns. "Some of us, especially younger warriors who have served in mixed-species units, have been questioning whether our traditions still serve us or have become chains we wear because we've forgotten why we forged them. You didn't just save Commander Velstrom's life. You forced us to face that question publicly. I just didn't want to watch someone die, because everyone was too worried about etiquette." "I know." Torvin's expression might have been a smile. It was hard to tell with Kithari facial structure. "That's what makes it so powerful. You acted on instinct, on human compassion, without calculating cultural implications. You simply saw someone who needed help and provided it. That a problem? That's revolutionary." Torvin's markings pulsed warm gold, and revolutions are always complicated. "Be prepared for that complication, Sergeant Reed." He left, and Marcus continued to his quarters, where he collapsed onto his bunk and tried not to think about the formal inquiry that was almost certainly coming. 3 hours later, Patterson sent word. Commander Velstrom had survived surgery and was expected to make full recovery. Marcus lay in the dark, exhausted and aching, and decided that whatever consequences came from carrying her through smoke and fire to safety would be worth it just for that message alone. The formal inquiry began 2 days later in a conference room that felt designed to make people uncomfortable. sterile white walls, chairs that were supposedly ergonomic for multiple species, but actually fit none of them well, lighting that was slightly too bright. Marcus sat alone on one side of a long table, facing a tribunal of concordance officers. A human colonel, a Tolian commander, and 3 Cathari elders whose bone-white markings indicated ancient lineage and significant authority within their species. The proceedings were formal, recorded, and excruciating in their attention to detail. They reviewed every aspect of the incident: Marcus's approach to Commander Velstrom, his assessment of her injuries, his decision to carry her despite her explicit orders to the contrary, his transport through the battlefield to the medical station. They called witnesses. Torvin testified about Cathari cultural protocols and why none of Velstrom's own soldiers could have acted without her permission. Patterson provided medical testimony about her injuries and the timeline for treatment. 3 Cathari warriors who'd witnessed the incident described their shock and confusion at seeing a human touch their commanding officer. Through it all, Marcus answered questions honestly and didn't apologize. Sergeant Reed, one of the Cathari elders said, his voice carrying harmonics that Marcus's translator rendered as stern authority. "You acknowledge that you violated Commander Velstrom's direct order." "Yes." "You acknowledge that you touched a Cathari superior officer without her permission, in full knowledge that such contact violates our most sacred taboos." "I knew it violated your customs, yes. And yet you proceeded anyway. Can you explain this decision?" Marcus took a breath, organizing thoughts he'd spent 2 days refining. Commander Velstrom was dying. Her injuries required immediate medical attention. Her own troops were unable to assist because of cultural restrictions. I'm not Cathari, so those restrictions don't apply to me. I made a tactical decision that saving her life was more important than respecting protocols that would have resulted in her death. "You call it a tactical decision," another elder said. "We call it profound insult. You treated a decorated warrior as helpless, dishonored her before her own troops, and violated traditions that have guided Cathari society for thousands of years." "I kept her alive," Marcus said evenly. "If that came with dishonor by your standards, then she's alive to feel that dishonor. The alternative was her being dead and very honored. I chose the option where she keeps breathing." One of the elders' markings flared angry crimson. "You reduce our sacred traditions to obstacles that were preventing medical treatment," Marcus interrupted, then caught himself. "Sir, with respect." The human colonel leaned forward. "Sergeant Reed, I understand your motivations. But you have to understand that concordance forces operate in coalition with dozens of species, each with their own cultural frameworks. We can't just ignore those frameworks whenever we find them inconvenient." "I wasn't finding it inconvenient, sir. I was watching someone die while the people who could help her were paralyzed by rules that made helping impossible without her permission. Permission she was too proud to give even as she bled out. And you took it upon yourself to override both her explicit orders and Cathari cultural law. I took it upon myself to provide emergency medical assistance to a critically wounded soldier. That's within my duties as a combat medic." Marcus met the colonel's eyes. "Sir, if this had been any other species, human, Tolian, Silvari, no one would question my actions. The only reason we're having this inquiry is because Cathari cultural taboos made standard emergency response into an international incident." "That's precisely the point," the 3rd Cathari elder said, his voice calmer than the others. "Our cultural frameworks are not mere preferences. They're fundamental to who we are as a people. To dismiss them as obstacles is to dismiss us." "I'm not dismissing your culture," Marcus said carefully. "I'm saying that in that specific moment, on that specific battlefield, your cultural protocols were going to result in Commander Velstrom's death. And I wasn't willing to let that happen just because acknowledging she needed help would have been shameful by your standards." The tribunal exchanged glances, their markings pulsing with colors that suggested intense internal debate. Then the lead elder spoke. "We will deliberate privately. You're dismissed, Sergeant Reed." Marcus stood, saluted, and left the conference room. Outside, he found his squad waiting: Patterson, Torvin, even a few of the Cathari soldiers who'd witnessed the original incident. "How'd it go?" Patterson asked. "Either they're going to court-martial me or give me a medal. Hard to tell." "For what it's worth, the younger Cathari contingent is on your side," Torvin said quietly. "We've been discussing what happened. Many of us believe you did the right thing, even if it violated tradition. And the older generation, deeply conflicted, you forced them to confront something uncomfortable. The possibility that our traditions, while born from valid cultural context, may have calcified into dogma that actively harms us." They waited for 2 hours. Marcus spent the time running through worst-case scenarios and trying not to think about how this would look on his service record. Finally, the tribunal recalled him. The Cathari elders' markings had settled into complex patterns that Marcus couldn't fully read, but the angry crimson was gone, replaced by contemplative blues and uncertain golds. The lead elder spoke, Sergeant Marcus Reed. "After extensive deliberation, this tribunal has reached the following conclusions. First, you did violate Cathari cultural protocols. This is not in dispute. Second, your violation was motivated not by disrespect, but by immediate concern for a wounded soldier's survival. Third, Commander Velstrom did survive because of your actions, actions that would not have been possible within Cathari cultural framework." He paused, his markings pulsing slowly. "These facts create tension we cannot easily resolve. Your actions were simultaneously wrong by our cultural standards and correct by pragmatic survival standards. To punish you severely would discourage future cross-species cooperation in emergency situations. To ignore your violation would suggest Cathari culture is meaningless. Therefore," the human colonel continued, "you are formally reprimanded for violation of cultural protocols and failure to follow a superior officer's direct orders. This reprimand will be entered in your service record." Marcus felt his stomach sink. A formal reprimand could impact his career significantly. "However," the second Cathari elder added, "we acknowledge that your actions, while culturally inappropriate, achieved optimal survival outcome. The reprimand is symbolic acknowledgement of violation rather than punitive measure. It will not affect your rank, assignment, or future service opportunities." Relief washed through Marcus, carefully controlled. "Thank you." "Additionally," the lead elder said, "Commander Velstrom has requested permission to address this tribunal regarding your actions. Permission has been granted. She will speak with you privately after these proceedings conclude." The tribunal formally closed the inquiry, and Marcus was released. He found Commander Velstrom waiting in a smaller conference room, standing despite the medical staff's probable recommendations that she remain seated. Her armor had been replaced with standard duty uniform, and her markings were visible, pulsing with colors that cycled between several states. Marcus had learned to recognize as complex emotional processing. When he entered, she dismissed the aide who'd accompanied her, leaving them alone. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus waited, letting her set the tone of whatever conversation was about to happen. "I ordered you not to touch me," she said finally. "You ignored that order." "Yes, Commander." "I told you it would be dishonor. You carried me anyway." "Yes, Commander." "Why?" The question carried weight beyond curiosity, genuine confusion, as if she still couldn't comprehend his motivation. Marcus considered his answer carefully. "Because I've been a soldier long enough to know the difference between honor and suicide. You were dying. Your troops couldn't help because of cultural restrictions. Someone had to act, and I was the only one there without those restrictions. You risked your career, risked diplomatic incident, risked," she stopped, her markings flashing uncertain gold. "You risked my wrath, which is not insignificant. I risked being yelled at by a decorated officer, Marcus said. Seemed like a fair trade for keeping you alive. Velstrom stared at him, her markings pulsing through colors that suggested she was processing information that didn't fit her cultural framework. In Cathari society, accepting help is weakness. Being carried like a helpless child is profound shame. You forced that shame upon me in front of my own troops. I kept you alive. If that comes with shame in your culture, then your culture needs to have some conversations about priorities. The bluntness of this statement made her blink. Then, to Marcus's absolute shock, she laughed. It was short, sharp, edged with pain from injuries still healing, but genuine. You're either remarkably brave or remarkably stupid. I've been told both, usually by the same people. Her expression turned serious, markings settling into steady blue. What you did has created complications. Younger warriors are questioning why their commander's troops couldn't save her but a human could. Traditionalists are outraged that sacred protocols were violated. And she stopped, struggling with words. I am grateful and ashamed in equal measure, which is an emotional state my people have no framework to process. For what it's worth, humans find that combination pretty difficult too. She moved closer, and Marcus noticed she was favoring her left side where the plasma burns had been worst. By the old codes that predate the taboos you violated, saving someone's life creates obligation. Life debt. I owe you that debt, Sergeant Reed. You don't owe me anything. I owe you my life. But I don't know how to honor that debt while also maintaining my position within a culture that says what you did was unforgivable violation. Her markings pulsed frustrated crimson. This is complicated. Marcus gestured to the chairs. Can we sit? You're still healing, and watching you stand at attention is making me nervous. She hesitated, then sat with visible relief. Marcus took the chair across from her, deliberately casual in his posture, trying to reduce the formal military tension. Forget the culture's opinion for a minute, he said. What do you think about what happened? Velstrom was quiet for a long moment, her markings cycling through contemplative colors. I think I would be dead if you had respected our traditions. I think my own troops, warriors I've served with for years, who I trust with my life in combat, were unable to help me because we've built a culture where asking for assistance is worse than dying. She met his eyes directly. I think perhaps we Cathari have confused strength with rigidity, honor with pride. We evolved our taboos on a harsh world where showing weakness meant death, where strict hierarchy maintained order during resource scarcity. Those traditions served us once, but we've carried them into the stars, into coalition service with dozens of species, and we haven't examined whether they still serve us or have become chains. That's a pretty profound realization. It's a terrifying realization, she corrected. Because if our fundamental cultural principles need examination, what else about our society needs to change? How do we maintain Cathari identity while adapting to realities that our ancestors never anticipated? Marcus had no answer for that. I'm just a Marine, Commander. Cultural evolution is above my pay grade. You're the Marine who saved my life by violating everything my culture holds sacred, Velstrom said quietly. You're the catalyst whether you intended to be or not. They talked for another hour. About Cathari culture, about the tension between tradition and survival, about what it meant to serve in coalition forces where your cultural framework might directly conflict with practical necessity. When Marcus finally left, he felt like he'd just been part of something bigger than a simple battlefield decision, like he'd accidentally triggered a conversation that the Cathari had been avoiding for generations. He was right. 6 months after the Battle of Crava's Ridge, Marcus received orders for a new assignment. Deep reconnaissance mission, joint human-Cathari operation, duration estimated at 3 weeks in hostile territory. He arrived at the briefing room to find Commander Velstrom leading the Cathari contingent, her armor pristine, her markings pulsing with steady professional composure. When she saw him, those markings shifted to warm gold. The color Marcus had learned meant respect and approval. "Sergeant Reed," she greeted him formally, "I requested your assignment to this operation. Because you owe me a life debt, or because you need someone who's good at ignoring orders?" Her markings flashed amused silver, both perhaps. The mission briefing was tactical and detailed. Intelligence gathering in Dominion-controlled space, minimal engagement protocols, emphasis on stealth and coordination. The success would depend on the human and Cathari units working in perfect synchronization. Historically, such close cooperation had been difficult. Cathari valued hierarchy and protocol. Humans valued adaptability and initiative. The cultural friction had complicated numerous past operations, but something had changed. The Cathari warriors assigned to this mission looked at Marcus, not with the suspicion or condescension he'd encountered 6 months ago, but with cautious respect. Word of what happened at Crava's Ridge had spread through both fleets, refined through retelling until it became something approaching legend. The human who dared to violate sacred taboos because someone needed help. The mission itself was tense, dangerous, and exhausting. 3 weeks of moving through enemy territory, gathering intelligence, avoiding detection. Marcus worked alongside Cathari warriors whose names he learned to pronounce, whose cultural gestures he learned to read, whose tactical capabilities earned his genuine respect. The turning point came in week 2. They were pinned down by Dominion patrol forces in a canyon that offered limited cover. The firefight was brutal. Marcus's squad and the Cathari unit trapped between enemy positions, ammunition running low, extraction impossible until they could break contact. A young Cathari warrior named Calvin took a plasma bolt to the chest and went down hard. He was conscious, but unable to stand, bleeding heavily from injuries that would kill him if untreated. The other Cathari soldiers moved to help, then hesitated, old programming asserting itself. Cultural taboos about touching another warrior without permission, about showing weakness, about accepting help. Marcus saw it happening again. Tradition overriding immediate need. Protocols paralyzing people who wanted to act but couldn't without violating fundamental cultural codes. He started moving toward Calvin, ready to repeat what he'd done with Commander Velstrom 6 months ago. But before he could reach the wounded warrior, another Cathari soldier, a young woman named Saris who'd been at Crava's Ridge, who'd witnessed Marcus carrying their commander, stepped forward without hesitation. She lifted Calvin with practiced efficiency, supporting his weight while maintaining defensive position, and carried him to better cover while providing suppressing fire with her free hand. It was the first time Marcus had seen a Cathari violate their own contact taboos in combat. The battle continued. They broke contact, extracted successfully, and returned to base with all personnel intact. But something had shifted, small, subtle, but undeniable. After debriefing, Commander Velstrom approached Marcus in the ready room. Saris carried Calvin without waiting for permission. "I noticed. Do you understand what that means?" She violated protocols that have governed Cathari military conduct for thousands of years. She prioritized immediate survival over cultural propriety. Velstrom's markings pulsed with color that cycled between pride and uncertainty. "She told me later that she learned it from watching you, that if a human could see past our traditions to what mattered, keeping people alive, then perhaps we Cathari should examine whether our traditions were serving us or constraining us." How are the elders taking that? Some are outraged, some are thoughtful, many are, beginning to ask questions they've avoided for generations. She met his eyes. "You've changed my people, Sergeant Reed, not dramatically, not completely. But you've planted seeds of doubt in traditions we've held as absolute truth. I just didn't want to watch people die, because everyone was too worried about etiquette. I know, that simplicity is what makes it so powerful." Her markings pulsed warm gold. "You didn't lecture us about our culture. You didn't demand we change. You simply acted according to your own values, that life matters more than protocol, and forced us to witness the results. But over the following months, small changes rippled through Cathari military culture. Training programs began including scenarios about cultural adaptability versus strict protocol adherence. Younger warriors started questioning taboos that prioritized tradition over tactical flexibility. Medical protocols were revised to allow emergency intervention without requiring explicit permission from wounded soldiers. Not revolution, not dramatic transformation, but evolution, slow, careful, often resisted by traditionalists but persistent. A year after Crava's Ridge, Marcus attended a ceremony honoring soldiers who'd served in the joint operations. Commander Velstrom was there, promoted to Fleet Coordinator for Human Cathari Tactical Integration, a position that didn't exist before someone decided the two species needed better frameworks for cooperation. She approached him after the ceremony, her markings pulsing with colors that suggested deep satisfaction mixed with ongoing complexity. "I've been asked to develop new protocols for cross-species emergency response," she said. "Guidelines that respect cultural frameworks while also acknowledging that survival sometimes requires flexibility." "That sounds complicated." "Extremely." She smiled, an expression Rai were using more frequently in mixed-species environments, learning that what they'd considered weakness was actually valuable communication. "But it's necessary work. You taught us that our traditions, while valuable, aren't more valuable than the lives they're supposed to protect." For what it's worth, I think most Cathari already knew that. They just needed someone to demonstrate it was okay to acknowledge it. Perhaps, her markings pulsed thoughtful blue, or perhaps we needed someone who cared more about people than protocols. Someone willing to be wrong by our standards, because being right meant watching someone die. Years later, the incident at Crava's Ridge became case study in Concordance military academies, taught in courses on cultural integration, tactical flexibility, and knowing when to follow rules versus following conscience. Cathari training evolved. Their young warriors still learned the traditional codes, still valued strength and hierarchy and honor. But they also learned that sometimes strength means accepting help, that honor includes preserving life rather than preserving pride, that adaptation isn't betrayal of culture but its evolution. And Marcus Reed, the human marine who carried a wounded commander through smoke and fire because she needed help and he could provide it, became symbol of what humanity brought to the stars. Not superior technology, not overwhelming military force, not cultural supremacy, just the simple, devastating courage to care about others even when tradition said you shouldn't. The willingness to be wrong by someone else's standards, because being right meant someone dying unnecessarily. The legend spread across concordant space, refined through retelling. No one dared to carry the alien woman until a human warrior stepped forward and held her in his arms. In that moment, he didn't just save one life. He began changing an entire culture's understanding of what strength truly means. Not rigidity, not pride, not adherence to tradition regardless of cost, but the courage to adapt, to accept help, to prioritize life over protocols. Marcus retired from active service eventually, teaching at the same academies where his actions were now case studies. Whenever students asked him about Crava's Ridge, about the decision to violate Cathari cultural taboos, about what he was thinking when he picked up Commander Velstrom despite her orders to leave her, his answer was always the same. "I wasn't thinking about culture or protocols or consequences. I just saw someone who needed help and I was able to provide it. Everything else was complications people added later." The action